Já, góðan daginn. Verið hjartanlega velkomin á fyrstu málstofu ársins hjá Hagfræðistofnun. Titillinn núna tilraunir í stuðningi við nýsköpun. Við fengið Eszteri til þess að vera með okkur. Erindi fer fram á ensku, þannig að kannski heppilegast að við skiptum bara yfir. So yeah, we'd just like to welcome you to the first seminar of the year. And so with us today is Eszter. I'm not really sure if I'm going to try pronouncing your last name, but you probably as your host then. So Eszter, if you please take over.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here today, and thank you all for joining. I am a new addition to the scene in Reykjavík, and it's a really exciting opportunity for me to meet more people and to talk to you about one of the topics that is really close to my heart, which is the experimental innovation policy. My name is Eszter Czibor, and August, I don't blame you for not attempting that C and Z is intimidating. So I moved to Reykjavík just about half a year ago. Before that, I lived in London and I worked for the UK's innovation foundation, Nesta. And in particular, I worked for their team called the Innovation Growth Lab. And in my role as principal researcher there, I worked in close collaboration with business departments, innovation agencies, and science and innovation funders. And basically, the remit of my role was to try and get people excited about the idea of embedding experimentation in their business processes, and then also to try and tackle basically these experiments in the wild. And that was a big change for me compared to my past, because before that, I spent 8 years in academia, first at the University of Amsterdam, obtaining a PhD in economics, and then 3 years at the University of Chicago, Department of Economics. And what I would like to do in this talk is to try and sort of bridge this gap between how academics often tend to think about experiments, even field experiments, and then, how to actually make them useful for practitioners and policymakers, and, how to make sure that they remain scientifically interesting and rigorous, and at the same time, they're actually answering questions relevant for policy and practice. So let me start by sharing my screen. And can you all see the screen now? I really hope that you do. Brilliant. So the plan for today is I'll give you a quick introduction to the experiments in this space, a bit of the what, why, and how. And then I'm going to highlight 2 case studies that I have been involved with. And these case studies are intentionally chosen to be on the kind of opposite edges of this spectrum of scrappy and agile and big and resource intensive. So we kind of see, what is possible. And the first one is going to be some pilots that I did with a challenge prize center, Nesta Challenges. And the second one is going to be a collection of trials and pilots funded by the European Commission through the InnoSub program. And then I will conclude, highlight some of my favorite resources in this space, and I will really aim to leave time for Q&A, because I would really, to make this as useful for me as possible, I would really, really love to have your feedback. So without further ado, let me get started on, just a quick one on how I consider the role of innovation support. Innovation matters. It matters because we recognize it as a driver of economic growth, but also because we look to it as, a way to address tough challenges facing society. Think about vaccine development, think about green technology. And another aspect that I find very interesting is its distributional effects. Of course, inventors and increasingly entrepreneurs benefit a lot from innovations that they bring to market. And I think there's a very clear rationale for policy intervention in this space. And this is to a large extent motivated by market failures. There are knowledge and technology spillovers from innovation. There's also the difficulty of the appropriability of innovation. And these are typically the reasons that we discuss why we think policy should intervene in this space. But there's another aspect that I think gets increasing attention. And this is related to the inequality in the benefits and costs and the inequality in participation in innovation. And just a few examples here are, this great insight from Asamoglu about automation, whether or not automation ends up being labor enhancing or labor replacing. It's not just a question of technology, it's a question of policy priorities. Or fantastic work by Dr. Liza Cook, who recognizes that groups in society, marginalized groups in society, are systematically excluded from innovation. And this makes us all poorer because we are missing out on their talent and ideas. But of course, just because we realize that we want to invest in innovation support, it's not quite clear how best to do it. And one of the reasons I find this area fascinating is because there are so many different levers that we could use to support innovation. In my talk, I'll primarily be focusing on these first two bullet points that I have listed here. So tax incentives, funding for research, R&D subsidies, and then also support for innovative entrepreneurs and support for regional innovation ecosystems. But there are, of course, an entire topic around intellectual property rights. Also, how do we create the human capital that is required for innovation? This both encompasses education policies, but also immigration policies. And of course, the general business environment, competition and trade policies also matter. And we need to recognize that despite tremendous interest and really, really interesting developments from recent years, both theoretical and empirical in this space, there are still open questions around how innovation works and what we can do on the ground to spur innovation. And one of the ways to approach this problem is to recognize that innovation agencies, innovation funders, could and should become more experimental in their ways. And what I mean by that can be really well captured by this seminal paper by the OECD. It's actually a collection of papers. It's a book published in 2014, where they capture the essence of experimental innovation policy as monitoring and evaluation, often diagnostic, that is embedded already at the design stage of any scheme, and then throughout implementation. So a big difference to how we typically approach monitoring and evaluation is that often it happens, it's commissioned and takes place at the end of the program, once a scheme has been delivered and wrapped up. And this shift of mindset to say, before we start thinking about anything, we want to see what are the policy questions that need answering here, and how do we design a program so that we maximize learning along the way. And the second point that they emphasize is constant learning and adjustment. And it seems, kind of obvious, but what I realized working with innovation agencies is even when we go through the trouble of testing, monitoring, experimenting, often there is no clear strategy from the results from the specific test to a change in policy. How are we actually going to use it? Is there room to adjust our practices in response to what we have learned? But of course, for the most part of this talk, I'll be talking about a very specific form of experiments, namely randomized experiments. So I would like to start by asking why, what is it that they bring to the table? What is their added value in this space? And of course, randomized experiments have this ability to replace selection into a scheme with random assignment, because kind of by definition. And this is really, really helpful if we want to establish causation. Consider the problem of trying to evaluate the impact of an accelerator program on the startup that participates. It's really hard to know just by simply observing the outcomes whether or not any difference that we observe can actually truly be attributable to the participation in the scheme, or would the entrepreneur have developed and grown the same way without. And if we observe other entrepreneurs who did not participate in this program, they are not necessarily the relevant comparison group. There is a reason why this particular entrepreneur either self-selected into participation or was chosen by us to participate. So those who were not may not be the relevant counterfactual. So basically, the strength of randomized experiments is in allowing us to construct credible counterfactuals. And this way, they're also really good at tackling this question of additionality. Would this have happened anyway without my intervention, without my support? And something that I think is worth highlighting is that in situations when we have a convincing way of measuring the outcome that we are really interested in, then randomized experiments can be really helpful in selecting. Oh, excuse me. Of course, some wonderful software update just popped up, but I hope you can all see the screen again. All right, so basically, when we have limited resources and a lot of different ideas and a lot of different schemes, then if we can agree on a common relevant outcome measure, then by running randomized experiments, we have a straightforward and credible way of explaining why we choose one scheme over the other, because we can actually produce credible impact estimates. So what does this look like in practice? This is a figure that I adopted from an NBER paper by Albert Bravo Biosca, who categorized experiments that we can run in this space into mechanism experiments, optimization experiments, and evaluation experiments. And mechanism experiments are related to, what the OECD paper called diagnostic evaluation. Very often, we just need to understand better the motivations, the constraints, the preferences of the actors in our ecosystem. And we want to understand, some more fundamental questions about what drives innovation, how is this particular aspect related to innovative outcomes. This is what we mean by mechanism experiments, trying to understand what the problem is, how our world works. Now, optimization experiments are related to how we actually deliver our programs. Are there moving parts in our program that we often just choose because of some kind of a legacy, rule of thumb, judgment, or just like, we picked something because we really weren't quite sure? And could we do them differently? Would they lead to different outcomes? So this is most related to the rapid A/B testing concepts that are very popular in tech companies. And then, of course, there are the evaluation experiments. And I think this is the most well-known use of randomized controlled trials, trying to randomize access to a program that we're creating a comparison group who does not receive our intervention, treatment group who does, and then comparing the average outcomes between the two groups, see, who did better and by how much. And a few examples for what they might look like in our particular field. And I'm very happy to share the slides with you eventually. And I really really encourage you to take a look at some of these specific articles that I have linked in here, especially the work of Kevin Boudreau and Karim Lakhani and their co-authors from the Harvard Laboratory for Innovation Sciences. They are really kind of the groundbreakers in showing how experiments can support innovation schemes, innovation policy making at various levels. So a few examples of mechanism experiments are related to the design of our schemes. So for instance, what if we changed the way we offer prizes in an innovation contest? Is it better to have one large winner takes all, or is it better to have 10 smaller prizes? You know, the total prize amount is the same, but how do we divide them? How does that affect both the effort that potential innovators put in, but also how does that affect the novelty and the riskiness of the ideas that they propose? Similarly, is it better to create lots of smaller tournaments or one larger tournament? And a really interesting one is related to the timing of disclosure, intermediate or final. How is that going to affect both the efficiency of innovation? Do you get to build on the intermediate ideas of others and converge to a solution sooner? But also to the space of discovery, are you all going to just converge way too soon because you're able to observe others' ideas? Now, a lot of optimization experiments are related to how we communicate about the particular funding, the particular support that we have available. And one of my favorite examples is from the MIT's Inclusive Innovation Challenge, where they found out that the way they emphasize either the potential social impact or the ability to access money through this prize is actually going to affect who applies, who participates, who submits a proposal to this prize. And maybe not surprisingly, you got a lot more lead applicants who are women when you emphasize their ability to make a difference for their community, to have social impact. Another really, really clever experiment in this space is related to establishing connections, establishing collaboration between scientists. Can a simple information exchange, just like a 90-minute session that you can add on to a grant application process, can that actually facilitate longer-term collaborations between academics from different fields who otherwise may not have met? And the answer, according to Boudreau et al., is yes. Finally, of course, the evaluation experiments, these are both what we think about most often, and these are also the ones where I tend to get the most pushback of, I don't know if this could be done. And Innovation Norway is showing us at the moment that it can be done. They are finalizing the data collection from this experiment that they registered in 2019. And they are trying out, what should a helpful support package be like? So they took the sample of SMEs applying for monetary support, and they basically randomized them into 3 groups. One group who, like those who were eligible. So among the eligible ones, they created randomly this group who just received the funding that they applied for. A second group who received the funding that they applied for, but they also got access to a business mentor for free. And the third group who got the funding that they applied for, and then they got the monetary equivalent of the business mentoring. Because, obviously it cost Innovation Norway to provide this additional mentoring. They paid for the business mentors for their time. So they said, okay, could actually the firms find a better use of that additional support than the mentoring? And I wish I could tell you which one comes out ahead, but we will have to wait about a year more for that. And the last thing that I want to emphasize in this space is that RCTs can really tackle various innovation policy priorities. So of course, the first one that we tend to think most about is, can our support increase innovative activity and innovative output? And a great example for this are the evaluations of innovation vouchers. The first one took place in the Netherlands in 2004 and 5. Second one in the UK, I think 2015. In both cases, they used a lottery to assign innovation vouchers to innovative SMEs. And these vouchers allowed them to establish connections with universities, with experts on intellectual property, etc. And in both cases, they found that having access to a relatively small value voucher, I think it was £5,000 in the UK and 7,500 euros in the Netherlands, it actually led to increased collaborations, increased use of the expertise located at these public research institutions. And in the case of the Netherlands, where they have like a longer term follow-up, they found that it also affected business survival and also their R&D activities 12 years on. But of course, there are also other questions that we are really interested in, going back to the very beginning of my motivation. And the first one is, can we broaden participation in innovation? Is there a way to make sure that we are actually drawing from the talent of, our whole population? And there have been really promising initiatives providing exposure to role models. In these cases, both providing exposure to young women, to role models in STEM and role models in entrepreneurship. And in both cases, these affected both attitudes of the participants towards themselves pursuing a career that is more likely to lead to innovation. But also in case of the first one, the exposure to STEM role models, it actually affected their choices in enrolling more STEM classes. Finally, I think it's important to recognize that policymakers are increasingly interested not just in the quantity of innovation, however you define, but also the direction, the novelty, the riskiness of the innovation that results from their programs. And I think it's very interesting to recognize that just the way we evaluate proposals often leads to less novel, less risky ideas being promoted over others that may involve a greater risk of failure, but also a higher upside. So this one is related, I think, both, this one would be both a mechanism and optimization experiment. How do we change our evaluation process to make sure that this is not the outcome? So before I move on to the first case study, is there any urgent, either clarification question or kind of a quick feedback on what you have heard so far? Let's see if I can see you all. No, very good. Well, do feel free, please, to either enter your questions in the chat, or if you have like something urgent that you would like to add or clarify, then feel free to use the raise hand function, and hopefully either August or I will be able to notice that. So
I'll just, Magnus here. I'll just throw in something for you to consider. Maybe you'll address it later on, which is just which is the thing that happens with randomized trials always, also with drug trials, which is basically how to justify, not doing what current knowledge says is the best thing and then doing something random, having like a lottery instead. How people approach that in this field. I mean, it's the same as, the argument for withholding a vaccine from someone while you're like doing the vaccine trial, rather than giving everyone. And I was just thinking about how people tackle that in this field. Not something you need to address immediately, or you can just go on and just something that is interesting to think about in these trials and others.
Magnus, that is a really, really excellent point. I will touch on it later, so I'll kind of refer back to that. But maybe one of the questions, one of the very straightforward ways that I have seen this addressed before is either related to programs being oversubscribed. This is how the innovation vouchers were delivered, both in the UK and in the Netherlands. They had a fixed budget, and a lot more SMEs were interested and eligible than they had budget for. And they said, look, we really don't have a good way to assess either merit or need among all of these SMEs who would like to participate. So we think that randomization is not just justifiable, but it's actually the most fair. So in those situations, I think things are easier. In other situations, and this is something that will come up later, sometimes you want to introduce a program that is so novel that you honestly don't know whether or not it will work. You have a good sense that it will not harm. Obviously, you wouldn't be considering it otherwise. But there's really genuine uncertainty around its potential impact. So in that case, it also makes a lot of sense to say, look, by excluding you from this, I'm not denying you something that I know for sure works. So it's a bit easier to say, and again, let me also give like a few other examples for how I had seen this tackled before, once we get to the European projects. But very, very important. And thank you for bringing that up. So this first example is going to be one of the optimization experiment examples. And it is also going to be one that for the researchers in the room, this is a little scrappy. This is not the one that you design when you're hoping to publish in a top 5 journal. This is the one that you design when you have kind of the questions and interests of the funder at heart over, the level of rigor that you would like at the heart of your hearts. And to try and see, what did we learn from this nonetheless, despite the scrappiness, despite the time pressure, how we ended up actually producing insights that I'm very excited about and quite proud of. So our partner in this, let's see, there we go. So our partner in these experiments was the Challenge Prize Center embedded at Nesta. And their business is basically running and administering challenge prizes, which are competitions that offer a reward for the first or the best solution brought forward by competitors to a specific well-defined social innovation problem. And we teamed up with program managers and researchers at Nesta Challenges to change the way they assess 2 of the challenge prizes that they ran. First one in 2020, second in 2021. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to tell you exactly which ones they were. But what is important to know is that both of these were related to, a specific, quite well-defined challenge, but the assessment of, what might the right answer be involved quite a lot of subjectivity by nature. The sample in both cases was reasonably large, but smaller than I had wished. In the first case, we came in after the first sift at the first judging round, when the number of applicants had already been whittled down through the first sift to just 60 proposals. And we had 12 evaluators, quite high-profile experts in that general topic. And every proposal was read and scored by 4 different evaluators. Now, in the second prize in 2021, we could already start collaborating at the first sift. So we saw the whole 148 proposals that came in to this challenge. We had 18 evaluators. They were, because this is the first sift, they are not kind of the top industry experts yet. Rather, they are volunteers from a large consulting company. And here we only had 2 evaluators reading and scoring each proposal. And one of the worries that our colleagues at Nesta Challenges had in relation to the assessment was, is there some kind of bias lurking here? And of course, an obvious question is there maybe gender bias in our funding decisions, as it has been shown in other contexts to exist? And there are many ways to try and test for the presence of this bias, to try and test strategies of eliminating. But the one that we found was most straightforwardly applicable to our situation was to try and see, to test for gender-based favoritism in evaluation. And what I mean by that is we were wondering if women are going to receive lower scores for their proposal when they are scored by men, and whether or not maybe the opposite of this exists. Maybe, women themselves are going to score up women's proposals and score men's proposals down. The reason we were wondering about this was because there is really strong evidence from teaching evaluations that female teachers receive lower evaluations from male students, but not from female students, despite their learning outcomes, their observable learning outcomes being the same, irrespective of the gender of the teacher. At the same time, the evidence from hiring committees is a lot more mixed. In particular, both in Italy and in Spain, having more women on hiring committees did not improve the outcomes of women applicants. So it was a genuinely open question for us whether this is something that we need to worry about in this space. So our design was really simple. We basically just randomly assigned proposals to evaluators, subject to the constraints that we had discussed before, that each proposal had to be read by the right number of evaluators, and we wanted every evaluator to read approximately the same number of proposals. And in one of the prizes, in the 2021 prize in particular, we also wanted to create as many different pairs, men applicant read by woman judge, etc. So kind of like to have like all 4 cells as comparable numbers of observations in each as possible. So that's the constraints that I'm referring to, but basically the assignment was conditionally random. And what that has done is it has essentially created this within proposal variation in whether the applicant and evaluator gender matched. And this allowed us to test the hypothesis whether proposals submitted by women receive higher relative scores as compared to men when they are evaluated by a woman rather than by a man. So our data had a very clear answer to this research question, and that answer was no. We did not find evidence of favoritism by gender. So the figure that you see here presents on what is my left-hand side, results from the 2020 prize, replicated again in the 2021 prize. And I'm just presenting here raw means by applicant and evaluator gender with 95% confidence intervals. And the reason the bars are different size in the 2 prizes is simply that they changed the scale that they used for scoring between the 2 competitions. In the first one, it was a 0 to 100, second one, 0 to 25. And what we observed is that proposals submitted by women receive higher scores on average. Proposals evaluated by women receive higher scores on average, but there is no gender interaction effect. There is no benefit from having an evaluator who has the same gender as you. And these findings were confirmed in a linear regression where we were able to include fixed effects both for proposals and for evaluators. Now, what is important to note, though, is that while we found no evidence of, preferential treatment for your own gender, this is not to be interpreted that there is no gender bias at all. And my favorite example for that comes from this paper by David Card and co-authors, who looked at journal submissions. And they found that referees, reviewers, who are men and women, tend to score submissions by men and women similarly. And yet, among the accepted papers, those submitted by women subsequently attracted more citations, controlling for observable characteristics, more citations than accepted papers by male authors, suggesting that their underlying quality was higher. So the quality threshold for acceptance for women was higher. It's just that both men and women reviewers favored submissions by men. Now, the second thing that we found, and this is what turned out to be a lot more interesting for our partners at Nesta Challenges, was that there was a lot of noise in the way these proposals were scored. What I'm showing you here is what happens between first sift and then the judging stage. So on the x-axis, I have the average score that each proposal received in the first sift, so their initial assessors. And then on the y-axis, we have the subsequent scores that they received from their judges. This is the subset of proposals that actually went through the first sift and were actually seen by the judges. And we see that the relationship between these two scores is really rather weak. And this means that there may have been proposals that had been kind of whittled out way too early, never made it to judges, because judges' opinion is actually quite unrelated to assessors' opinions. So this is a bit worrisome. Now, we also found that there's a huge difference in evaluators in how lenient they are, and also in their tendency to basically use the full scale for evaluation, or if we basically only have like really, just use the middle of the score, the scale when they are evaluating. On this image, we have plotted the judge fixed effects. So basically controlling for, kind of like differencing out proposal quality. What is the impact of having received, having been randomly matched to judge 1 as opposed to judge 3? And here the outcome of interest in this regression where we estimated this fixed effect was actually the proposal's final rank. So this is once we have aggregated the judge scores, and there even was a mediation meeting where there was a chance to move scores up and down a little bit, following a discussion between judges. And yet, having a very lenient judge confers you permanent advantage, when it comes to whether or not you pass to, the next judging stage. And this was also something that our partners were quite surprised to hear, especially because they had really already put in place a number of measures to try and stop this from happening. So what did we do in response to this? Well, first of all, testing for favoritism now became a standard part of the assessment process. So they stuck to a random assignment of evaluators to proposals. And this way, afterwards, they're always able to check. And of course, this does not have to be confined to gender. In one of the proposals, this was an international competition, and one big worry was, is there a bias against applicants from new EU member states? This is something that you can check if you stick to random assignment. And one of the things that we couldn't do, even though we were really, we really wished we had done, was to try and test for bias along lines of race and ethnicity. And this is something we couldn't do because it's not data that we typically collect. So this is a question of how do we change our data collection process to try, to allow us to test for that in the future. And in response to our findings related to noise, one of the things that the funder now implemented was not only random matching, but the normalization process, with the idea being in place that if every judge or assessor is going to read, in our case, 15 to 20 different proposals, which are randomly assigned, there is no reason to believe that the distribution of their scores should be so wildly different. So basically try and remove the judge fixed effects from the scores before making the decision of whether or not to advance a proposal. And this is also a time to give a shout out for randomization or partial randomization in funding, to say that we think that we base our funding decisions on merit, but there's a lot of lurking bias and definitely a lot of noise in our funding decisions. So there's a good case to be made that maybe once we have, identified really top applicants where everybody agrees they are great, and we have identified applicants where nobody really wants to make a case for them, there's this big middle ground where there's just a lot of uncertainty, a lot of disagreement. Why don't we randomize access to funding in that middle ground? And let me see how I am with time. Oh, I'm desperately late with time. So the insights for researchers is something that, if you're a researcher on the call and would love to learn, how we did the randomization, what that meant for analysis, get in touch. I'm always really happy to talk about this. So let's get to talking about the pilots all across Europe. This was a Horizon 2020 program with the aim to encourage innovation agencies to embed randomized experimentation in their policy schemes. In total, 13 pilots and trials got funded with collaboration between 27 national and regional agencies. The map is desperately off. I could not locate Hungary on this map, but it still gives you a general idea, from Greece to the UK, Spain, Germany, a lot of different agencies were involved. And they were testing schemes related to encouraging co-creation, the use of user-centered design, different programs related to digital transformation of SMEs. And the size of these projects varied widely, from 60,000 for tiny pilots involving just 10 SMEs to 700,000 euros for really large pilots encompassing 300 SMEs. And this is one of my answers for Magnus's excellent question is, how can we justify randomization in this case? And we have seen a lot of really innovative answers to that question here. And we discussed the control group sometimes just gets nothing because we don't even know if our innovative scheme makes any difference. But sometimes they said, look, the control group will just receive whatever is business as usual, and the treatment group is going to get our new exciting scheme. Sometimes they introduced something called, a placebo treatment, where they were interested in a very specific outcome. Sometimes this was related to intermediate outcomes, such as, how does our treatment affect leaders' ability to embed, inclusion by age? Can we get more innovative outputs through this particular channel of making it easier to get ideas from across the age distribution in a firm? This was a very specific treatment, very specific outcome. So they introduced a placebo treatment for others to try and see, okay, they're going to do something different that we don't expect is going to affect this outcome. Do we see a difference in this very specific measure that we're interested in? Others used a pared down version of the treatments. They said, we don't have enough capacity to give a consultant to every participant. So the control group just receives this tool. They can engage with it on their own. The treatment group gets the tool, but they also get very intense one-on-one consulting to try and help them use this tool. And we have seen many examples of a waitlist control group or phase-in design where they said, our treatment group receives whatever scheme we have available right now, and their control group is going to get it in a year or two. Note, in each case, the choice of control group affects, the ultimate comparison that you're able to make. So that's something to keep in mind. Let me make sure that I can show you. What I would really like to show you basically is what have we learned from, is this worth doing and when? And we have seen a lot of innovative schemes, and a lot of the agencies we talked to said this really allowed us to try something that we really wanted, but could not garner support for in the past. And many of them also said it really changed the way we approach evaluation. We are really much better at collecting quantitative outcome data, and we really started planning upfront. A big thing was, getting a really good theory of change. Why do we expect this program to work, and what are the intermediate steps that need to happen, and do we have support for those assumptions? And one thing that we were really happy with, because we facilitated it, was the success of peer learning. So the fact that we had a group of 27 agencies who could come together, share their issues, and actually very often get answers, not from us, but from each other, was really, really great to see, and also very popular. Now, what did not work well is a lot of these schemes were very innovative. So there was actually nothing to guarantee that SMEs were interested, and especially nothing to guarantee, unfortunately, that SMEs were interested in it at the time of the great upheaval that the pandemic has introduced, and in case of British participants, Brexit. So a lot of the times, innovation agencies found that they could just not meet their sample size target because of lack of interest. And another thing that could have gone a lot better was collaboration with external experts. Very often these would be academics, other cases it would be consultants. And when it happened, it was super valuable. But a lot of the times, the innovation agencies did not have existing ties with people in this space, especially with people who were familiar with randomized experiments. So while they maybe got very valuable support, from experts on innovation, on how do they construct their outcome measure surveys, they still had a lot of trouble with how do we randomize in practice. And I think, let me make sure. All right, we have 2 minutes. So I'm going to conclude with basically, what have I gleaned from like 8 years of learning about experiments, and then 2.5 years of supporting experiments in the wild about, what is their value, and when should we do them, and when should we just forget about them? And I think my main takeaway is that you need to have a specific policy question in mind, and you need to design an experiment to answer that question, not just run an experiment because, I told you, or because there is now this great, credibility revolution going on. And what I mean by that is I have seen experiments run at, considerable resources and cost and annoyance to the agency. And then these experiments produced the result, and everybody said, this just confirmed what we already knew. We didn't really benefit from this. It did not shift people's priors, and it did not change their behaviors. And it turns out the experiment was not designed to answer any pressing question they had. And so, they were just like, well, okay, well, now we know, but we always knew. So let's not run experiments when we don't have a compelling reason to do them. And I think there's also this idea of we don't experiment for the sake of experimenting, not just because it's, resources, but also because the recipients of support actually really value predictability and stability. So let's make sure that they can actually count on, schemes that are popular and successful, not being, constantly changed in major ways, unless we have a compelling reason to do, which we think really benefits and, makes up for the fact that, there's this annoyance. So a great example of, when we think we should be doing them is practically anything related to optimizing delivery. These are the small tweaks, how do we evaluate these? How do we communicate about these? What is the right size of this incentive? What should constitute, part of the support? These are usually easy to embed, and they yield a lot of surprising insights, very often beyond the specific question that we asked. And also, when our schemes are oversubscribed, then using a lottery feels really straightforward and really helps us make a case for the impact. So I'm going to share the slides with you later so you can see all these resources that I think are super interesting in this space. If you allow a special shout out for our very recently published Experimental Research Funders Handbook. This distills a lot of our learning in this space. And with that, I would like to give the floor to you, and I'd be really curious to hear, is there something that you disagree with? Is there something that you wish I had discussed but I haven't? Or what is your own experience with running experiments in this space? And people always say like feedback is welcome, but in this particular case, because I'm so new to this space, I really am very eager to make connections with you, have conversations, see if we can work together. So please do get in touch.
Yeah, well, thank you, Eszter. We have 10 minutes-ish for Q&A, so feel free to interrupt us.
You don't answer.
Jónþór has raised his
Yes,
hand,
please,
so
please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm sorry I had a local Zoom problem. So yeah, requiring a reinstalling of the application. I had two questions because I recently participated as an evaluator in something similar that you're describing. And what I experience as a complication is that depends really what order you are receiving the proposals or what kind of. So have you or any of the authors that you are citing tested whether the order is affecting and if that can be sort of corrected in some way? That's number one. And secondly, you describe, and it's a very troubling in many sense, in the large sense, how dispersed the views of assessors are. And I wonder if anyone has tested using a dynamic process or a process that has a dynamic number of assessors per proposal, depending on the, say, variance of the assessments thus far.
Those are really, really interesting questions. And for the order effect, you're absolutely right. So there exists a good body of evidence from a lot of different fields, actually, about the existence of order effects in evaluation. I've even seen a paper that claims that going second is the best, but my guess would be that it's probably context dependent. But this is this is an example where an optimization experiment could be very straightforwardly embedded in this process, because all we would have to do is, if the assessment system allows, is to create random orders for proposals to be read. Especially in situations like we had, when every proposal would be evaluated by 4 judges. You could really make sure that the same proposal is not going to be read first by all 4 judges. Or one of the things that we actually did, we didn't do it experimentally, but we just kind of embedded it already without testing with the same Nesta Challenges team, was to say, we are going to randomize assignment, but we're going to randomize assignment in a way that actually tries to, like this was at the judging stage, that says, we're going to make sure that no single judge is going to only receive proposals from the top of the score distribution based on assessors. So these are ways, and exactly, these are things that are very easy to embed and probably very high return in terms of the fairness of the process. And the second idea, I have not heard of it, and I think that's a really, really exciting idea, especially because the main thing I have heard working with innovation agencies, from like FFG in Austria to NASA SBIR, is this is such a resource-intensive process. Getting a high number of assessors who are topic experts to spend hours reading, 20-page long proposals, terribly costly. So could we make sure that, this sounds like a wonderful thing that we could test also in a shadow experiment, try to see, let's keep things as they are. Everything is read, say, by 4 judges. And then we do a shadow experiment where we say, what would have happened if just the first 2 judges agree, then we just go with their score. If the first 2 judges disagree, we bring in the 3rd or the 4th. What happens? Does it actually change the distribution? Can we save time and resources? This is a really fascinating idea.
Let's see. I'll probably not be naming names, so. Oh yeah, Tina raised her hand, so please go ahead.
Hi, Esther. This is Tina.
Hi.
So you mentioned that you are new to this context, and I think you're talking about Iceland there. So even though we would of course like to call you one of our own, you do have that valuable perspective of the outsider looking in. So I was wondering what your thoughts were as an outsider who knows the context fairly well, the different aspects of the Icelandic context, the homogeneous population, the size of the country. Are there any things that you can see as particular strengths for conducting randomized experiments in economics here within this context? What would you think our strengths would be here? At face value. Any thoughts on that?
That's a really, really interesting question. And my first answer would be quality of data, because one thing that I skipped is it's really difficult in our context to get reliable and reasonably timely measurements of the outcomes that we're interested in. It's one thing to run an experiment on innovation, but then having no really reliable way to find out what actually happens. Is innovative activity taking place? And, is actual innovation output produced? And the data in Iceland, is like Nordic countries. It's a lot better than many that I had seen in other contexts. So I think that's definitely an advantage. And I think it's also, in our context, I think a focus on, making, broadening participation and making access more equitable. I think it makes sense in our situation to focus on gender. In the context of the UK, I was somewhat uneasy to prioritize a focus on gender, where we knew that the real difference was between access to participation and funding, between scientists and inventors who come from a minoritized ethnic background. And I think in Iceland, a focus on gender would be warranted. And I think that's also something that even if we do not specifically collect the data, compared to some other languages, inferring gender of both the applicant and the judge, is a lot easier. So it again saves time and makes data collection easier.